As above, so below.
Welcome to Connecting with Coincidence. I am your host, Bernard Beitman, MD, and I am going to be talking with you about the perception of synchronicity. So a lot of people have different ways of looking at how synchronicity happens. There are various explanations. But as I will try to show you today, the primary explanation, is your mind, your ability to see one pattern, another pattern, and see that they're similar. That's the beginning of creating a meaningful coincidence. How those patterns get there is what people tend to talk about, but your perception of those patterns is what is fundamental. And what I'll talk with you mostly about today are three different aspects of perceiving meaningful coincidences. Self-awareness, or what is also known as your observing self, is necessary because you have to see the two patterns have similarity and you have to notice them. So some part of you, I'll call the observing self, notices the similarity and notice first each of the individual patterns. Second is clearly the need and ability that each of us has to recognize patterns. Pattern recognition is fundamental to human beings and many other beings who walk around or crawl around on this planet. So our ability to recognize patterns varies too under the different circumstances and also who we are. When I talk about meaningful coincidences, I'm talking about serendipity and synchronicity. Without noticing a coincidence, it doesn't exist. If a tree falls in a forest and no one hears the noise, or no one hears a sound, does the tree make a sound? Well, you can argue about that by saying sound. What do you mean by sound? Sound could be something you record on a machine. So the machine records it, a human being doesn't, or someone actually is there. Is sound a sound wave, or is sound something that has to be heard by somebody else? And that philosophical question has been around for centuries, perhaps started with George Berkeley, after whom Berkeley was named, a reverend. He thought things didn't exist until you saw them. Well, that's a question that we will get to. If nobody sees it, nobody hears it, nobody notices the coincidence, does it exist? Simple answer to that is no, it doesn't exist. Somebody else could see it. But if no one sees it, why is that? Because what we mean by meaningful coincidences is there's meaning in it. And where does the meaning come from? It could be an interaction between ourselves and what's around us. The universe, some people call it Gaia, some kind of fabric of reality that we're perceiving, something like that, but it still requires our participation. We at least are co-creators of meaningful coincidences. So you have to see them. If you don't see them, nobody else sees them, they don't exist. Well, Jung started with talking about meaningful coincidences, at least formally, in his book Synchronicity, came out in 1973. And he offered another explanation from cause and effect for synchronicities, and that was synchronicity. I mean, his use of synchronicity was primarily to explain meaningful coincidences, but the terms have gotten overlapping. But let's think of synchronicity as what Jung mostly emphasized as an acausal connecting principle. And that gets a little confusing too. Acausal, no cause. Well, for him, the cause in quotes maybe is like you find meaning. that the two events of a meaningful coincidences are connected by meaning, and meaning becomes a way of describing explanation. Again, Jung didn't emphasize this. You got to see the meaning first. Otherwise, there's no synchronicity. And Jung's paradigmatic synchronicity involved one of his patients and a beetle. The patient dreamed of an expensive scarab ring. Jung went to his office window and caught a rose Schaefer, a beetle strongly resembling a scarab, an Egyptian symbol. Here, an element of the patient's dream resembled external reality. Jung had to see that possibility first before he presented it to the patient. So that's the meaning in a synchronicity. The serendipity paradigmatic story is from Alexander Fleming and the discovery of penicillin. He had been seeking a better antibiotic than they had in those days. The sulfa drugs just weren't doing it. Upon coming back from vacation, he looked at the petri dishes in his laboratory sink and saw evidence that juice from a mold that had landed in this petri dish that had a lot of stuff that different bacteria and molds like to live on, the juice coming out of this golden mold was killing the bacteria. So he said, well, that's an interesting observation. Well, he had seen something killing bacteria in a petri dish many years ago, many years before 1929 when he had this experience. 1921, he had a cold and he had nasal drippings coming out of his nose, and those drippings landed on a petri dish. And then he watched how the lysozymes, as they got called from the nasal drippings, also created a halo of disinhibition where they stopped, or of inhibition where they stopped the bacteria from growing. So he'd seen it before. So the coincidence here was he'd seen it from the nasal dripping years previously, then he saw it again from the mold juice, and aha, that mold that was producing the juice ended up being called penicillin. Well, that penicillin, he got a Nobel Prize in 1945, but there's a whole long story about how that actually happened. A lot of other coincidences, serendipities were necessary. So those are two paradigmatic examples of having a person notice two patterns that were similar and then making a conclusion from them. In order to do that, both Jung and Alexander Fleming had to observe their minds coming up with noticing the patterns and seeing their similarities. And self-observation refers to the practice of consciously observing one's thoughts, emotions, and behaviors. Self-observation entails an active scan of one's inner landscape, which includes intentions, expectations, images, feelings, cognition, and then the ability to introspect about one's thought, to think about one's own thinking, as well as how I relate to my social group and my cultural environment. The heightened capacity of self-observations can make individuals more attuned to the subtle synchronicities that occur in their lives. So you have to have the ability of stepping back, as some people say, and observe. Step back, activate your observing self, and observe. Now, what about pattern recognition? How do we think about that? Pattern recognition occurs when information from the environment is received and entered into short-term memory, leading to the automatic. It just happens quickly. Our brains do this, our minds do this, to the automatic activation of specific content from long-term memories. So we have something happening right now, and then our mind brains put the two together and say, hey, these two are similar. That is like this. That is like this. This process allows us to predict and expect what is coming based on the patterns we recognize. It involves matching the received information with information already stored in the brain, making connections between memories and perceived information. Meaningful coincidences can be misinterpreted in two major ways. One way is called type 1 error, and another is called type 2 error, just to get fancy in statistics and psychology. In type 1 error, the person sees patterns connecting the two incidents that are not there. In other words, you see more meaning in the patterns than is actually there. And type 2 errors miss the pattern that is likely to be there. So you can overdo seeing something, and you can underdo seeing some meaning in some coincidences. An example of seeing meaning when there is none, please consider this story. A person is contemplating whether to accept a job offer in a different city. The person feels torn, uncertain. One evening, as he is discussing the dilemma with a friend, he receives a phone call from an old acquaintance who lives in the same city as the job offer. Wow, look at that. The old acquaintance knows nothing about the company that made the offer. So this guy takes this as a sign, getting the phone call from the person in the same city he wanted a job, that he should take the job. However, the phone call could also mean don't take the job. The person is choosing the interpretation he prefers. There's nothing in the phone call that says take the job, but he is inferring what he wants to see, that he should take the job. There is no apparent meaning in this coincidence. On the other side of this, is someone going through a major life transition who might dream of being her own funeral without considering the possibility that the dream reflected the tumultuous situation of her current life. The dreamer missed the likely meaning of this coincidence, namely that the dream reflects what's going on in her life. She just missed it. It was easy for me when she told me about it to say, well, look, that's what it looks like from the outside. There are personality variables also that have something to do with coincidences happening or seeing them or not. And my research group had developed something called the Weird Coincidence Survey, which you can take on my website to get an estimate of how sensitive you are to coincidences. Or you can go to the website of the Coincidence Project and also do it there. We've got about 4,000 responses now, and one of these days we'll do some more data analysis, as we did early on when we first developed the Weird Coincidence Survey. What we found was 5 personality traits emerged as potential markers of heightened coincidence sensitivity. The most significant personality trait was referential thinking, which is characterized by beliefs, quote, events around me refer and have to do with me. Well, that's the fundamental to meaningful coincidences. So if you're predisposed to see events around you referring to you, then you're likely to see more coincidences. I mean, it's nice to get data, and that's what we did. The next most significant personality trait was positive and negative affect. A high emotional charge, whether positive or negative, is likely to increase the number of connections between thoughts and environmental events. That may be part of the explanation for why coincidences are more commonly observed, experienced during major life stressors, major life transformations, transitions. Next came religious commitment, which is often associated with the idea that a higher power intervenes personally in people's lives. We did have other data that people who think of themselves as spiritual tend to see more synchronicities than those who don't. Partly in both these cases, these are people who are willing to look at their environment and connect what's going on around them with what's going on in their own minds. They may think that the meaningful coincidences, those who are spiritual and religiously connected, are more likely to interpret the coincidence as being helped by some other power, some other intelligence beyond them. And then the last trait we found to be meaningful is people who are searching for meaning in life. People who are searching for meaning in life are looking for connections between what they're thinking and feeling and what's out there. So it's not just knowing meaning in life, you got to be looking for it. And if you're looking for meaning, you're more easily making connections between what's in your mind and what's outside of your mind. Other researchers have found correlations between intuition and scores on the Weird Coincidence Survey. We were kind of surprised we didn't find that connection because intuition is so important, but intuition gets defined in different ways in different instruments and different self-report questionnaires. So that could be part of the problem, the different questionnaire used to determine intuition and correlate it with the Weird Coincidence Survey. Well, finishing up here, we'll recognize that debate will continue about explanations for synchronicity. The primary arguments people use tend to be God, universe, quantum physics, randomness, or statistics. This quantum physics one leads to, again, a very difficult thing to really understand, but it becomes quantum field, and I think there are other ways of thinking about the fields in which we are operating. And my idea is to label the field the psychosphere, that is our mental atmosphere, the mental atmosphere in which we are functioning. So perceiving meaningful coincidences relies on your activating your observing self, relies on your ability to see patterns with some degree of like reasonableness, and then also your personality type influences what you'll see. So thank you very much, and these are important ideas that I hope you find of interest in understanding how meaningful coincidences take place.
This psychosphere is our mental atmosphere, like a hologram of cosmic consciousness.